On my desk here today, I've got two very affordable all-in-one DAC and amp combos. One of them you've heard of before, one of them you probably haven't. One of them also costs $70 more than the other one. So there's a couple of key questions coming into today. Does spending you more get you a better product? And are you better off sticking with the more well-known brand? Let's explore. I've been asked about the FiiO K5 Pro quite a number of times on the channel, and it's sometimes hard for me to get my hands on FiiO gear, so on this occasion I ended up buying the K5 Pro secondhand on eBay. Before I could get around to reviewing it though, I was contacted by Hi-Fi College who offered to send me out the FX-Audio DAC-M1. They're very similar products, and so to me it made sense to put them head to head. The K5 Pro retails for $150, whereas the DAC-M1 retails for $220. So the product that you may have never heard of before comes in more expensive than the very well-known K5 Pro, and therefore begs the question, is it worth spending more on a brand you may not have heard of? And does it therefore net you better sound quality? The answers are not quite as straightforward as a yes or a no. Before we get into the details of why it's not a cut and dry answer, I want to say a huge thanks to Hi-Fi College for sending me the DAC-M1. As always, there'll be the link down below if you do want to buy the DAC-M1 after hearing what I have to say, and of course I'll provide some links where you can buy the K5 Pro as well. I should make it clear, there's no affiliation with Hi-Fi College, this is just a way of saying thank you to them for making the review possible.
I forgot to mention that I have a strong urge, a thirst for the word. Inside daydreams, I can see past the caravans, be caught inside an oyster, shimmering, glimmering, make waves in the sky, stick my tongue.
Now let's take a look at what's different and similar about these on paper before we get into some of the details about the sound quality, both of the DAC stages on their own, but also operating as an all-in-one using the headphone amp. The first thing, of course, just to reiterate, is the price. You've got $150 for the K5 Pro, and you've got $220 for the DAC-M1. Size-wise, as you can see, they're fairly similar in their overall volume, but the DAC-M1 is a more compact footprint, it just sits a bit taller. On the inside of these devices, you've got an AKM AK4493 in the K5 Pro, and in the DAC-M1, you've got an ESS 9038Q2M. Now, if those numbers don't mean anything to you, don't worry too much about it. I've discussed multiple times on the channel the fact that the chip being used in a particular device doesn't dictate how good it sounds. If you've watched the recent Great Dongle Fondle that I did, where I compared a whole lot of different dongle DACs, one of the DACs that had an older version chip from a particular manufacturer actually sounded better than another DAC using the more up-to-date chip. So chip doesn't mean a huge deal, I'm just sharing it with you in case you've got a particular fancy for AKM or Sabre chips. Beyond that, there are some other similarities and differences. The amplification from the K5 Pro is significantly stronger. This can drive 1.5 watts into 32 ohms, whereas the DAC-M1 can only produce 500 milliwatts into 32 ohms. That's going to drive most normal headphones perfectly fine, particularly the sorts of things you're likely to be driving at this budget end of the market, but it is worth noting that if you are looking to drive more challenging loads, maybe high impedance headphones, then you may find the K5 Pro just a little bit more capable there. I did most of my testing with the Meza Elites, which are pretty easy to drive. They're way beyond the level of headphone I would normally expect you to pair with these, but I wanted to hear exactly what they were capable of. In terms of power delivery though, what it showed me was that even something as simple to drive as the Elites still pushed the M1 here to about 50% volume, whereas the K5 Pro was purring along in low gain at below 50%. So do take that into account depending on what you're driving. If it's normal, moderate sensitivity, open or closed back standard headphones, both will do just fine, and IEMs as well. It's only if you're looking into the more difficult stuff, such as high impedance or difficult planars, that you might want the K5 Pro. And that's not even talking about sound quality, that's purely talking about power. I'll talk about inputs and outputs in a moment, but before we get there, let's talk about a couple of other things you can see on the front panels of these devices. The K5 Pro tells you everything you need to know, or everything it thinks you need to know, using a coloured ring around the volume control. It will change colour to indicate the different sample rates coming through, and that's all the info you get. If we take a closer look at it, you can see you've got the input switch here, which will move you through the USB input, the line input for analog, or the SPDIF input for either optical or coaxial. You've then got a 3-level gain switch, which is great, so you've got low, medium and high gain. You've got the volume knob here, which has a nice click to switch the unit on and off. And then finally, you've got a 6.3mm headphone jack. So nothing too fancy, it's a pretty ordinary, normal kind of setup, but it's what you'd expect for this type of product. Looking then at the DAC-M1, this is even simpler still on the surface. So we've got a power button here, which is also a mute button. We've got a 6.3mm socket and a volume control, which is also a control dial. And that's because most of what you're going to see from the DAC-M1 is actually coming at you via the OLED screen. So the DAC-M1 will show you which filter you've got selected, what sample rate you're listening to, what the exact volume level is. It'll tell you all of that, the source input of course. It'll tell you all of that through the OLED display. Now some people are going to love having all that information shown to them. Others will prefer the simplicity of the K5 Pro. So I'm not going to say which one's better or worse. I'm just going to present them for what they give you and let you work that out for yourself. Something that I just touched on there that is unique to the DAC-M1 in this comparison is that it does provide you with some filter choices. As always, filter choices don't make a huge difference to the sound of a device, but they can tweak things like the spatial representation and how sharp the attack on things like transients will be. So it's nice to have the tweakability from some aspects. On the other hand, sometimes it's great just to plug something in, turn up the volume and enjoy listening. Something else the display and the menu system on the DAC-M1 lets you do is choose how the outputs work. So you've got on both devices, you've got line out to go to a DAC, or powered speakers if you want to, and then you've also got the headphone output. On the K5 Pro, you've got one or the other running. If you plug in headphones, it's going to mute the outputs. When you unplug the headphones, the outputs come alive. If you're using the DAC-M1, you have the choice to either have both outputs on all the time, meaning that you can leave your headphones plugged in and then just switch on whatever your other source is, be it a power amplifier, a pair of active speakers, maybe it's a separate external headphone amp. Whatever it is, you can switch that on or off regardless of what the headphones are doing. On the other hand, you might want a muting headphone socket that switches off the outputs to say a pair of powered speakers, and the DAC-M1 will do that if you set it up that way in the menu. So there is a little bit more versatility from the DAC-M1 in that regard. It's not a big deal, but it's nice to have. For the final differences worth talking about, let's take a look at the back of the devices, starting again with the K5 Pro. As you can see, looking at the back of the K5 Pro, we've got a power socket, we've got a USB socket, we've got an analog line out, an analog line in, optical and coaxial. So everything there you'd expect based on what I said about the input switch, and it's perfectly functional enough. It's got everything you're likely to need. But when you go to the DAC-M1, there is one extra thing. Having a look at the back of this, we've once again got a power input. We've got USB-C this time, and optical, coaxial, and a couple of outputs. So we've traded off this time the pair of analog inputs, and instead we've got this stubby little part of a Bluetooth antenna because I haven't attached the antenna itself, and that tells us that this has Bluetooth capabilities instead of a line input. So you've got a bit of a choice here. You can take a device that will take a line input from an external source, or you can have a device that's going to allow you to feed a Bluetooth signal from, say, your phone. Which one's more important to you is going to be very personal. So again, I'm not going to make any recommendations based on the inputs and outputs. I'm just going to tell you what's there and let you decide if either of those setups is a deal breaker. Beyond that, for me, it all comes down to sound quality. And I'm going to break down sound quality in two ways. First of all, we're going to talk about just the DAC stage in these. So that's feeding each of these out to the FiiO Labs Aries amplifier, a very transparent, excellent quality amp, so I could just hear what the individual DACs in these were doing. I'll then talk about how each device performed and how they compared, running them in their all-in-one state, where I just plugged the headphones direct into the devices with no external amplification. But let's start talking about the DACs. My setup for this test ended up actually being a blind one, and what I mean by that was I hooked these up about a week past and I'd forgotten which one was on which input to the FiiO Labs Aries. So what that meant was when I came back to do my testing and my thorough listening, I had no idea which was which, and I just switched between the two and made my notes based on one being called input 1, the other one being called input 2. And I immediately noticed that one DAC was clearly more spacious and detailed than the other. The DAC on input 1 was a bit richer, a bit warmer, a bit more intimate, and therefore also a little bit less detailed. So things were just all brought in a little bit and a little bit thicker sounding. In contrast, the DAC that was driving input 2 was more spacious, there was a greater sense of clarity, imaging was clearer, and there was more separation between each sound. Both were completely enjoyable, I wouldn't have minded either, but input 2 to me was clearly the superior sound. And when I finally got around to having a look at which one was which, it was the FX-Audio DAC-M1 that was the better of the two DACs. So purely running as a DAC, I was preferring the FX-Audio. To give you a bit more extra detail on how the sound compares between the two, I did my usual tests running through lots of different tracks, and one of the ones I made notes on was Mercy Street by Peter Gabriel. On this track, the bass from the K5 Pro was a little bit fuller and more present, and that's neither a good or a bad thing. I've got no way of knowing what the original track was meant to sound like, and therefore I'm not going to say one was right and one was wrong, they were just different. Some will prefer the extra bit of body and presence in the bass from the K5 Pro, whereas others will like the leaner, cleaner sounding and tighter sounding bass from the DAC-M1. One area that the DAC-M1 was clearly superior in my mind compared to the K5 Pro was that it brought more clarity to the percussion sounds that are mostly on the right. I think there's a little bit on the left as well, but those had more clarity. They're sort of a bell-like sound, and they just had a greater sense of clarity and resonance and were better separated from everything as well, listening from the DAC-M1. Thinking about the vocals, the K5 vocals were a bit thicker and a bit lusher, but what I was hearing from the M1 was an overall better textured and still tonally accurate vocal rendition. So for me, in the vocal area, the M1 once again had the upper hand. The final thing that really stood out as I listened to Mercy Street was the soundstage size. Listening to the K5 Pro, the soundstage stopped right in line with my ears and was very, very flat as well. It wasn't bad to listen to by any stretch, but I was very aware that it was a small, fairly compressed soundstage. The DAC-M1 isn't going to win any awards overall in the scheme of DACs, but compared to the K5 Pro, it stretched the soundstage just a little bit wider, so I would now say the soundstage was going as far as the edge of the headphones instead of the edge of my head. The M1 also produced just a little bit better sense of depth and layering. Most Delta Sigma chip-based DACs aren't going to do a fantastic job at depth, and that's true for both of these, but definitely the DAC-M1 does it a little bit better than the K5 Pro. And so for me, if I was looking at one of these purely as a DAC, it will be a hands down easy win to the DAC-M1. But of course, most of you are probably going to be looking at these sorts of products because they're an all-in-one. They can drive your headphones and be your DAC. So let's take a look at the all-in-one performance of these using the internal DAC and the headphone amp stage. For the all-in-one test, I was listening to Devil's Tears by Angus and Julia Stone, and I immediately found that using the internal headphone amp, the K5 Pro came across more authoritative and with a better sense of presence and dynamics. It had some punch and some energy that I felt was lacking a little bit from the DAC-M1. The DAC-M1, on the other hand, sounded quite thin and clinical, a little bit sterile. It wasn't unenjoyable to listen to, but it didn't have the presence that the K5 Pro did. To me, it felt like the DAC-M1 was putting too much emphasis into things like the snare and the guitar work in this particular track, and I was missing some of the richness and resonance that the K5 Pro was delivering. The K5 is still a little bit more intimate sounding than the DAC-M1, but the difference once you're using the internal amplifiers is much smaller than when you're using just the DACs with external amplification. And that says to me that the amplification stage in the K5 Pro is stronger in terms of quality. It also happens to be in terms of power, but more importantly, it's of a higher quality than the amplification stage in the DAC-M1. Overall, I personally found the tonality from the K5 Pro to be preferable from the M1. There will be some that will like the sense of cleanliness, tightness in the bass, overall sort of neutrality, if you want to call it that, from the DAC-M1. But for me, I think the K5 Pro is the more natural presentation when using the internal headphone amp. And so I'm not going to overextend this review for the sake of it. There's not really a lot more to say. It might be that one of these has a feature that is a deal breaker for you not to have, such as the line in. Maybe you have to have that, in which case the K5 Pro is still a great choice regardless. Or maybe you must have Bluetooth, in which case it's the DAC-M1. But if you're not so fussed about the features and you're looking at these more purely from a sound quality point of view, my summary on these would be that if you're just looking for a DAC or predominantly a DAC with occasional internal headphone amp use, then I'd personally be buying the DAC-M1. If though you are looking at this as a true all-in-one, you're not going to be looking to have external amplification, then for me, the K5 Pro is still the better option. I think overall, having spent time with both, I enjoy interacting with the K5 Pro better. Given that it's a bit cheaper, it's got the stronger headphone amp, and I don't tend to use Bluetooth so much, I would probably lean as an all-in-one pretty heavily towards the K5 Pro. But as I said, if you're looking at it mostly for a DAC, the FX-Audio DAC-M1 is still the better choice. So hopefully that's helped clarify your choices. Hopefully it's either saved you some money and allowed you to go for the K5 Pro with confidence, or it stopped you from wasting money on the K5 Pro when the DAC performance from the DAC-M1 is more to your liking. Either way, I hope it's been helpful. If it has, I'd love it if you'd subscribe and like the video. It really helps the channel to keep growing and sharing content like this with you. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.